happens when a customer who looked low risk at onboarding starts behaving differently 6 months later? Maybe their transaction volume suddenly increases. Maybe they begin sending funds to a new beneficiary. Maybe their usual corridors change, activity starts happening at unusual times, or a new sanctions or screening signal appears. None of those events necessarily mean much on their own. The challenge is understanding them in the context against the customer's identity, previous behavior, transaction history, screening status, and the patterns your business considers risky. For compliance teams, that means monitoring cannot stop at onboarding, and it cannot rely only on static thresholds. You need to understand what changed, whether the activity is unusual for that customer, which signals are contributing to the risk, and whether the case needs further investigation. That becomes harder when transaction data, customer information, screening results, and investigation workflows sit across different systems. The result is more manual work, less context at the point of decision, and greater inconsistency in how risk is assessed. Shufti Transaction Trust Monitoring brings those pieces together, combining configurable monitoring rules, customer risk profiles, behavioral context, transaction scoring, alert prioritization, investigation, case management, and regulatory reporting within one connected workflow. Welcome back to the Innovation Drop by Shufti. In episode 1, we looked at qualified electronic signatures. In this second episode, we're moving beyond onboarding and into ongoing transaction risk. Let me show you how it works. Welcome to the Shufti Global Trust Platform. This is where businesses can access Shufti's trust and compliance solutions across the customer lifecycle, from identity verification at onboarding through to ongoing transaction monitoring and investigation. For this demo, we'll focus on transaction trust monitoring. We'll look at how monitoring rules are configured, the data available to those rules, how customer risk develops over time, and how potentially suspicious activity moves into investigation and regulatory reporting. So let's click through our TTM components tab. Within Transaction Trust Monitoring, we have 4 core areas: rules and discover attributes, regulatory reporting, and the alert queue. Let's start with rules. This is the rule library, where compliance teams manage the monitoring logic applied to customer transactions. Each rule is organized by information such as discipline, typology, priority, and industry as well, giving the team a clear view of the controls operating across the monitoring program. We can see some examples here covering areas such as transaction thresholds, structuring patterns, and beneficiary activity. The key point is that monitoring does not have to rely on a fixed set of provider-defined scenarios. Businesses can configure controls around their own customers, products, transaction patterns, and risk appetite. And there are 2 ways to create rules. The first is manual creation. This is useful when compliance teams already know the specific behavior they want to detect. For example, this could be a transaction above a defined value, a certain number of transactions within a time period, activity involving a particular corridor, or a combination of customer, transaction, and behavioral attributes. The compliance team can configure and refine that logic directly rather than depending on engineering each time a threshold or monitoring condition changes. And this gives compliance teams greater control over the program while keeping the underlying monitoring logic visible and explainable. Let's build a simple example. I'll create a rule called repeated sub-threshold transfers. We can give it a description such as identify customers making multiple outbound transfers below $10,000 within a 24-hour period. I will select structuring as the typology and the discipline as AML, as this is a money laundering scenario. And now we can define the behavior. I will select activity over time because I want to detect a pattern across multiple transactions rather than one transaction in isolation. For the data point, I will choose customer ID, and this tells the platform to assess the activity per customer regardless of whether the individual transactions may involve different beneficiaries or payment methods. For the function, I will choose count, so number of matching transactions. I'll set the window to 24 hours. The operator to greater or equal to. And the value free. So at this stage, our rule says for each customer, count matching transactions over 24 hours and trigger when these are free or more. So now I'll define what qualifies as a matching transaction. For this, I will add value check for the data point transaction amount in dollars. And I will select greater or equal to. I will select greater or equal to number 8,000. And a second value check, looking at again transaction amount in dollars. Where this is less or equal to 10,000. So the rule is specifically looking for repeated transactions that remain below the 10,000 threshold. So put together, our rule says, has the customer made 3 or more transactions between $8,000 and $10,000 within a rolling 24-hour period? Finally, I can select the action. I can choose between approve, decline, manual review, or watch. I will put this as watch and set a priority of high. And I can also set a risk score. This can be random or static. In this case, we can put a static risk score of 90. Finally, we just need to review our rule and click publish for this to become live. Now we've seen how we can manually create rules. Let's now see how we can use the AI agent to simplify rule creation. The alternative to manual rule creation is using the AI rule builder. Instead of starting with an individual rule, we can provide the platform with context about the business and use that context to generate a proposed monitoring framework. So we start by selecting industry-related parameters, for example, fintech, sub-industry, remittance, and customer type individuals. And next we can go into more detailed transaction assessment information. This includes core information such as sender, beneficiary details, amount, currency, transaction type, timestamp, and status, but the monitoring engine can also work with broader contextual signals, including IP location and jurisdictions, sanctions and PEP screening for both the sender and the receiver, device fingerprinting, VPN and proxy detection, account details, and finally, there is also a space to capture business-specific requirements or scenarios that may not already be represented in the standard configuration. Next, we can define the risk scenarios we want to detect. For example, we can configure structuring here, where multiple transactions may be used to remain below a reporting threshold. We just need to define the threshold, followed by specifying the currency, as well as the time frame. We can also configure rapid-fire transactions, unusual transaction amounts, multiple new receivers, mule account detection, as well as account takeover indicators. Further down, we have scenarios including transaction thresholdings, sanctions, and PEP exposure, high-risk corridor transactions, dormant account reactivation, cross-border anomalies, business hour violations, duplicate transactions, and similar to our previous. And finally, we also have the possibility of describing a specific scenario within this field. Next, we add the regulatory context around your monitoring program. Here, your compliance team can identify the frameworks and jurisdictions that apply to your business, for example, FATF recommendations, FinCEN requirements, European AML regulation, UK money laundering rules, or PSD2. You can also select a specific country from the drop-down list for local jurisdiction requirements. Further down, you can also opt to describe in plain terms a rule that you would like to see generated. And finally, you can select the risk appetite that is appropriate for your business. A more conservative approach may surface a broader range of activity for review, while a more liberal approach can focus on higher confidence risk signals. A balance setting sits between the two, and this gives you control over how sensitive the monitoring program should be, so the rules generated reflect both your regulatory obligations and your own risk approach. Finally, we can click Generate Rules, and we will be able to review them before deciding which rules to apply. Once the context is complete, the AI Rule Builder generates a proposed set of monitoring rules for your team to review. Here you can see the scenarios being suggested, along with information such as the priority, recommended action, and risk score as well. The important point is that AI is helping you accelerate the configuration process, but it is not deciding what gets deployed. Your compliance team can review the proposed rules, make any adjustments needed, and decide which controls should become part of your monitoring program. So you get the speed of AI-assisted rule creation while still retaining human oversight and control over the monitoring logic. By clicking Continue, we will add the rules to our rule library. Now that we have seen rules creation, let's explore Discover Attributes. If rules define what you want to monitor, Discover Attributes shows you the data you can use to build that monitoring logic. Here, you can work with a much broader set of information than just transaction amount, country, or currency. You can select information around customer, transaction data, device intelligence, account attributes, screening results, behavioral indicators, and jurisdictional context as well. Across the wider monitoring model, Transaction Trust Monitoring can work with more than 1,600 enriched data points per transaction. And the value, of course, is in the ability to combine these signals. And if you are already using Shufti for capabilities such as KYC, KYB, or AML screening, that information can contribute to the monitoring context. You can also bring in your own proprietary data such as device, channel, IP, or transaction attributes, so your monitoring rules can reflect the data and risk signals that are actually relevant to your business. Once the monitoring rules identify activity that requires attention, it moves into the alert queue, so let's explore this section. This gives your compliance teams a central view of the alerts that need to be reviewed and helps them prioritize that work based on risk and urgency. At a glance, you can see the customer, compliance discipline, reviewer tier, and this can be customized according to your business. You can also see the transaction amount, when the alert was triggered, the status, who it is assigned to, and an estimated SLA for resolving this alert. So rather than every alert entering the same manual review process, you can route cases according to your own operating model and make sure that the highest priority activity is handled by the right person within the required time frame. So let's open one of these alerts. Here, the analyst immediately gets the context behind the alert rather than starting from a single rule hit. At the top, we can see the customer, the transaction, the reason for the review, in this case, a sanctions match. We can see the suggested tier for the reviewer, as well as an SLA for this activity to be reviewed. And the platform then can help the analyst understand what is driving the risk. First, we have an AI-generated summary which brings the key information together into a concise starting point for the investigation. We also provide a false positive assessment. This looks at the available customer and transaction signals and highlights whether there may be a plausible, legitimate explanation for the activity. This is designed as a decision support. It does not automatically close the alert. The analyst remains responsible for the outcome. Next, we have recommended actions depending on the case that could include requesting additional customer information, reviewing sources of funds, validating the beneficiary relationship, considering additional monitoring, or progressing the case towards regulatory reporting as well. So the analyst is not only being told what unusual looks like, they're also being given a structured starting point for what to investigate next. Further down, we have transaction context and customer information into view. This can include sender, beneficiary, and transaction details, together with information around KYC status, customer history, transaction amount, payment method, account information, source of funds context, where this is available as well. And the analyst can understand who the customer is, who they're transacting with, and whether the activity makes sense in the context of that relationship. Further down, we have some triggered signals. We separate these into priority, critical, or high. Further down, we have transaction signals. We then separate the wider context into positive, neutral, or risk signals. For example, an established customer with enhanced KYC and a long history of approved transactions can provide a positive context. A familiar device or activity taking place during the customer's normal hours may be neutral, and at the same time, a sanctions exposure, a sharp change in corridor activity, or an undeclared beneficiary relationship may increase the risk. And this gives the analyst a more balanced view of the case rather than focusing only on the rule that generated the alert. If we scroll down, we can see linked transactions for the same customer, and this allows the analyst to understand whether the current event is isolated or if it is part of a broader pattern. They can review previous transaction values, corridors, rule hits, risk scores, outcomes, including whether similar activity previously generated alerts or was closed as a false positive. And this historical context can be particularly useful when assessing repeat behavior. And finally, we have audit trail, which is supported by information. This records how the case developed, from the rules that fired for the alert and the risk assessment to assignment, escalation, and subsequent analyst actions. So from the same workflow, the team can also perform case management. So from the same investigation, the analyst can also manage the case directly. The case actions panel gives the team a structured set of next steps. They can reassign the case to another analyst or compliance tier. They can also add supporting notes to this particular case. If more information is required, they can request customer information, or they can escalate to a different tier if the risk increases or the case needs more senior review. Once the investigation is complete, the analyst can also close the case as false positive, close it as resolved, or where appropriate, progress it toward SAR/STR filing as well. Now let's explore regulatory reports, a section currently in beta production. This is where the workflow can continue if an investigation progresses towards a regulatory filing. So rather than treating reporting as a completely separate process, the aim is to keep it connected to the alert and the investigation that generated it. Within the SAR/STR queue, the team can manage suspicious activity reporting with visibility into information such as the report type, jurisdiction, subject, linked alerts, the deadline, the status, and the regulatory reference as well. The decision to submit a suspicious activity, it remains human-led, and the report can move through stages from draft to MLRO review, validation, and acknowledgement as well. The platform supports the workflow around that decision and helps retain the context behind it. For threshold-based reporting requirements, there is also CTR auto batch. Rather than handling every qualifying transaction individually, transactions that meet the relevant criteria can be grouped into a reporting batch, and your team can see which transactions are included, their cumulative value, and the relevant submission window as well. And this helps reduce manual work associated with predictable threshold-based reporting. And finally, we have jurisdictions as well. This is particularly relevant if you operate across multiple markets because regulatory reporting requirements are not the same everywhere, and different jurisdictions can have different financial intelligence units, reporting thresholds, submission methods, schemas, and filing deadlines as well. In this example, we have configurations for the United States, Nigeria, and Iraq. For each jurisdiction, your team can see the relevant regulatory authority together with information such as submission method, reporting format, portal, CTR threshold, and reporting timelines. So, for example, the United States configuration is linked to FinCEN, while Nigeria is configured around the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit and its reporting process. The benefit is that your analysts do not have to treat every market as if it has the same reporting rules. The relevant local requirements can sit alongside the monitoring and investigation workflow. And if you expand into a new market, you can simply add that jurisdiction and capture the relevant submission methods, schema, portal, and reporting thresholds as well. So far, we have looked at the controls you can configure and the data those controls can use. Now, for our final part, we will move from the transaction itself to the customer behind it. Here, you can see information such as the customer's primary transaction corridor, current risk score and tier, profile maturity, and date of last activity. The key point is that customer risk is not treated as static. A customer may appear low risk when they first onboard, but their behavior can change over time. They may begin transacting at higher volumes, using new beneficiaries, operating across different corridors, or showing changes in device or screening information, and those changes can all contribute to the customer's ongoing risk profile. And as more activity is observed, the profile that Shufti creates becomes more mature. The platform can build a clearer understanding of what is normal for that particular customer, their typical transaction values, frequency corridors, and broader activity patterns. At the top, we have the customer score information together with their current risk score, and we can compare that with their onboarding position to understand how risk has evolved. We can also see their main transfer corridors over here and how much of their activity is concentrated across each route. The behavioral baseline gives us a picture of what normal activity looks like for this customer. For example, their average transaction value, their transaction frequency, most used payment method, usual device, typical time of day, common corridor, average number of new beneficiaries, and most used channel as well. Alongside that, we can see their financial profile, which shows information such as declared income, employment, purpose of the account, expected monthly volume, or whether observed activity is moving beyond these declared expectations. We also have the customer's current screening status, including sanctions, PEP, and adverse media results, together with when the customer was last screened. Further down, the analyst can move through transaction activity, alerts, linked entities, and risk signals as well. They can review the customer's transaction history. They can filter this activity as well. And overall, when the alert is raised, the analyst is not looking at one payment in isolation. They can ask, did this transaction trigger a rule, but also, is this behavior consistent with what normal behavior looks like for this particular customer? And this gives your team a much stronger basis for deciding whether the activity genuinely requires further investigation. So across the 5 areas we have looked at, the journey is connected. You define the monitoring controls that are relevant to your business. Those controls can use a broad set of transaction identity and behavioral data. Customer risk can evolve as behavior changes. Alerts can then be prioritized and routed for investigation. And where activity needs to progress further, the workflow can continue into regulatory reporting, all within the wider Shufti Global Trust platform. So, bringing the complete journey together, Shufti Transaction Trust Monitoring gives compliance teams custom and no-code rule creation together with AI-assisted rule builder for configuring monitoring scenarios around industry, customer type, typology, regulation, and risk appetite. The underlying monitoring engine can work with a broad set of transaction identity, customer screening, and behavioral attributes. The customer profile brings transaction history, screening information, and behavioral context together so new activity can be assessed against what is normal for that customer. Alerts can then be risk scored, prioritized, and routed to the appropriate compliance tier. During investigation, analysts receive a detailed report with an AI-generated summary, false positive assessments, recommended action, trigger ruled explanation, transaction signals, and linked transaction history. Case management sits within the same workflow with reassignments, notes, additional information request, escalation, and human decision-making built into the investigation. The audit trail retains the history behind those actions. And where a case needs to progress further, the regulatory reporting model supports SAR, STR workflows, CTR batching, and jurisdiction-specific reporting configuration, all within the wider Shufti Global Trust platform. Transaction monitoring is most effective when the alert is not the end of the story, but the start of a connected investigation. With Shufti Transaction Trust Monitoring, the activity being monitored stays connected to the customer behind it, the behavioral and risk context surrounding it, the investigation that follows, and the compliance decision taken at the end. That gives analysts a clear view of why activity matters, gives compliance teams greater control over how monitoring is configured and managed, and creates a more consistent, auditable path from detection through to resolution. If you are reviewing your transaction monitoring program, speak with Shufti to see how the transaction trust monitoring solution can fit into your existing compliance workflow. And this wraps up the episode 2 of Innovation Drop by Shufti. In episode 1, we looked at qualified electronic signature. Today, we move beyond onboarding into transaction risk. And next, we'll move into digital assets, looking at how Shufti supports travel rule compliance. Make sure you catch the next Innovation Drop episode.